It's full of chat.
Well, I would like to
really.
welcome you back to our Bible study class. It's good to be with all these scholars. And as we look at these very ancient texts, we are going to be concluding tonight our study of the Old Testament book, 1 Samuel, which includes the story of some very colorful characters. Of course, the hero or the chief protagonist of 1 Samuel is David, and the events that will lead up to him eventually becoming king of Israel. There is another character of great importance, and that is the first king of Israel, which is Saul. And he starts out in a way that's very impressive, but we saw the gradual deterioration of his personality and how he was consumed by his jealousy of David, because David became a very popular warrior in ancient Israel, and his jealousy caused him to become paranoid and ultimately murderous in his intentions to destroy David. And David becomes a refugee, a man who is in flight, being pursued by Saul. And then there is another character who we read last week. We read of his death, and that is Samuel. Samuel, who is called a seer, a prophet, and he also was raised by the family of the high priest, and he had a connection with the tabernacle. And he is considered the last judge of Israel. Israel was a tribal confederation of 12 tribes. They were ruled by judges, which were charismatic leaders that were raised up when the people of Israel were encountering trouble from their violent neighbors. And the judge would then bring deliverance to the people of Israel, and then would be considered basically the leader of Israel until they passed from the scene. And then Israel was a nation that was very tribal, and they had a tremendous lack of unity, which made them vulnerable to their powerful neighbors, in particular the Philistines. The Philistines were an interesting ethnic group. They were, we believe, that they somehow were related to the Minoan civilization that was centered in Crete, and that civilization abruptly ended in about 1600 BC. And now it is believed that what destroyed that great and sophisticated civilization that was very advanced, it was a sudden demise, and we believe it was because of the volcanic eruption of what is now the island of Santorini in Greece. A huge tidal wave as a result of that washed up on Crete, which was the major population center of this civilization, and it really destroys the Minoan civilization. They are never able to recover from that. And so these mysterious people called the Sea Peoples about this time arrive in northern Egypt. They came with their powerful navy to resettle, because everything was destroyed in the Aegean Sea because of this was a massive volcanic eruption. I'm not sure if they would call it a super volcano, but it was pretty serious. And some archaeologists or historians even speculate that some of the plagues that are recorded for us in the book of Exodus was really the result of this natural catastrophe, or somehow played a role in the plagues that hit Egypt. That's an interesting proposal. Well, the Egyptians were able to repel the Sea Peoples, and they ended up sailing to the northeast and settled in the coastal plain of the land of Canaan, which, as you know, was the promised land, and they became known as the Philistines. And they had 5 city-states and 5 kings. They were very advanced in the military technology of the age, while the Egyptians and the people of Israel were using bronze instruments and their ability to make weapons. The Philistines were already in what we call the Iron Age. Well, if you have a sword made of iron and you go up against a sword made of bronze, it would be like going up with tin foil against steel. It's just not going to be able to endure that kind of fight. So the Philistines were arriving on the shores of Canaan at the same time that the Israelites were coming from the desert after 40 years of wandering from the east, and they crossed into the Jordan River. Consequently, the Israelites settled in what we call the highlands. There is, geographically, as you come in from the deserts to the east, the elevation drops down into what we call the Great Rift Valley, which is where the Jordan River flows through. These are familiar things, and it drains into what is called the Dead Sea. And that Rift Valley is the lowest surface on the earth, land surface, an average depth of 1,250 feet below sea level, much lower than Death Valley is here in California. The only difference is Death Valley is just a total wasteland of desert, where in the Rift Valley there is a river that flows 12 months out of the year, 24/7. And so it becomes a very lush garden area. But then as you cross over the river and you begin to continue heading west on your journey, then there is a steep incline and you come to the mountains of Judah. And the mountainous region continues north into the Galilee, even up as far as what is known as the mountains of Lebanon. The people of Israel conquered and occupied the mountains of Israel. And they were prevented by the Philistines of taking over most of the coastal land. So this was the situation historically that we come to when we read the opening chapters of the book of Samuel. This is the reality. And because of the threat of the Philistines militarily upon the people of Israel, there was a great desire that Israel would be united as a single nation with a single ruler, a king. And in ancient times, the only way you could really unify a people is that you shared the same king. So they put pressure on Samuel, who is the last remaining king, last remaining judge of Israel. He's a prophet, he's a priest, and they pressure him to anoint someone to be a king. And he anoints Saul, and Saul becomes the first king. Saul is an impressive young man. He's extremely tall. More than once he's described as being a head and shoulders taller than everyone else. And indeed, he had a certain charisma about him, and he was able to unify, and people accepted and recognized him as the king of all of Israel, even though he was from the tribe of Benjamin, which is one of the smallest tribes of Israel, interestingly enough. The largest being Judah. Not long after, Samuel and Saul began to have tension in their relationship. And we could read between the lines that this was obviously a political issue between them. It became very personal, and Samuel turns against King Saul. And then Samuel accuses Saul of committing sins, breaking certain directions that came according to Samuel from God. And basically what we saw is that Samuel was losing control over Saul. Saul was beginning to assert his own authority, and Samuel didn't like losing control of the king. That's what we see reading through between the lines. And so between this power struggle between the prophet Samuel and the king, the new king Saul, Samuel does something rather subversive. He secretly goes to one of the prominent families of the tribe of Judah, and he anoints the youngest son of Jesse to be the king, and that is David. And David's but a youth at this time. This is done secretly. It was clandestine, but it creates political problems for Saul. Then, in one of the battles between the Israelite army and that of Saul, they meet the champion of the Philistines, and that is Goliath. And David becomes the hero because he kills Goliath, and David becomes a national hero, and he wins the love and affection of all the people of Israel almost. And they began to sing a song, which you're going to see here. Saul kills his thousands and David kills his tens of thousands. So David became a popular man. Saul tries to control David. David becomes more popular than him, and he tries to find some ways. He makes him the head of his private bodyguard, you know. And so David now has a position of military power. It was an effort on behalf of the king to keep David under control, because he was afraid of David. Saul was insecure in his position, especially since Samuel was railing against him at every opportunity. Then what you have happen is that David's popularity continues to grow. He goes out and wins battles, and Saul even becomes more jealous and attempts in fits of rage to kill David. But he fails to do so. David was a musician, and we are told that the way the writers put it, that an evil spirit came and haunted Saul, and he had terrible headaches and became extremely irrational and irritable. Today, we would say he was probably bipolar. And that's supposed to be a joke. But they didn't have those understanding in the ancient world, so it was an evil spirit that did this, and so David's music would calm him. But even after a while, Saul's rage was so out of control that even while David was playing music for him, he would take a javelin and, you know, try to pin David to the wall, and et cetera, et cetera. So Saul was a political realist. He knew that David was a threat, and so another way he tried to control David was that he offered David his daughter in marriage, which means David would be the son-in-law of the king, and that would obligate David to his father-in-law. It's another way of trying to control him. And so he marries Micaiah, and then it wasn't enough. Saul just was obsessed with his hatred of David, and so David has to go into flight. He becomes, I said a refugee, but a fugitive. And then an interesting thing develops. The crown prince, that is, the heir to Saul's throne, Saul's firstborn son, or eldest son, legally, Jonathan, really loves David, and David loves Jonathan. And we find this unusual language, which we find nowhere else in the Bible. The closest that we can find it is in John's Gospel to describe the relationship between Jesus and the disciple whom he loved, which is another mysterious expression. We are told by the writer in 1 Samuel that the love between David and Saul was more than a man would have for a woman. They were just really in tight and really loved each other, and they were very close to each other. We don't know much about the relation other than that, and that Jonathan was very loyal, and Jonathan recognized that David would make the better king and even supports him. Saul is deeply enraged by this relationship between his son, and he even confronts him. Don't you realize, if you're friends with David, that David's going to take the throne away from you? That seemed to be okay with Jonathan, as he is portrayed in this account. So David, who is now a fugitive, gathers around him a lot of other outlaws, and I compared that to the story of Robin Hood. Remember Robin Hood and his merry men? David and his merry men, and there's all kinds of escapades that's going there. David now enters into an alliance with the Philistines, which is really treasonous that he does this. But the writer of, or writers of 1 Samuel are very careful to make it known that David did this as a ruse, to fool the Philistines, and to buy time. And David all along was plotting against the Philistines. Ultimately, it won't be in this book, but in the book of 2 Samuel, which we will start next week, David will overwhelm the Philistines and conquer the Philistines. There will never more historically ever be a Philistine problem. And in fact, the Philistines become personal vassals to David. And when David is king, he has a whole regiment of Philistines that work for him. So David is a cagey, clever politician, but David is also a man of very good character. Now, when David was fleeing, he passes through the city of the priests, and he gets the showbread and gets supplies from the high priest. The high priest was not aware. This is the high priest, what was his name? Ahimelech. Ahimelech, the high priest, aids David when he's a fugitive and supplies him and his men with bread and supplies, and sends him on his way. In the meantime, Saul is in hot pursuit of David. He comes across the priest. He learns that the priest not only supplied David, but also consulted the Lord for David. Now, consulting the Lord. The way the priest did it was much different than the way the prophets did it. The prophets, God would speak to the prophets, and the prophets received their oracles as they were singing and chanting and dancing, and they would be filled with the Spirit, and out would become the oracles. They weren't asking for oracles, God just spoke through them. That's how the prophets developed. But when it says they were consulting the Lord, it meant that they went to the high priest, who wore a woven breast cover called the ephod, and in the ephod there was two pockets, and in the pockets were kept the Urim and the Thummim, and we don't know exactly what they looked like, some kind of dice, maybe. And so you would go and pose a question to the Lord, and the priest would then throw the dice and divinize what the Lord is saying to you. Shall I go and conquer the Philistines? Yes, the Lord is with you. It says so in the stones. It is a type of, what does you call that? Divinization. It's a type of divinization that was done. People are shocked to know this. They don't, when they read the Bible, they don't know. They pass over that and they don't realize what they really were doing. But that's how people would determine the will of God. I'm planning on doing this. And you go to the high priest, and I'm sure with a special offering to the priest, to go get, and he'll tell you what to do. Well, this enraged Saul, that the high priest would consult for David. So Saul then asked his guard to execute the high priest's family, and all of the priests that were there. There were, lots of priests. I think there was dozens of them, if not more. The guards refused to do it, but there was an Edomite who was a foreigner who was in the employ of Saul as an officer, and he told the Edomite, who had no fear of killing the priests. The Israelites didn't want to lay a hand on God's anointed priests. That would be bad news. But the Edomite had no problem, and so Saul murders almost the entire family of Ahimelech, except one of his sons escapes, and that's Abiathar. Abiathar then seeks out David, and David feels responsible. If he had not gotten the supplies, he would not have created a situation in which Abiathar would lose his family. So what you see in this is that you see that Saul had absolutely no scruples and was willing to slaughter the priests wholesale. Even though they helped David, they didn't know that David was a fugitive. And so this is how deranged Saul had become. And it will be part of his undoing. But David, when he sees Abiathar, the only survivor, takes responsibility. It was my actions that led to the death of your family and to all the priests. Stay with me, and I will protect you. And so now Abiathar, who is now, because it's hereditary, the high priest, Abiathar is now the high priest, and he is in alliance with David. So you see David's political power is continuing to grow. You know that David took on a couple of other wives who happen to have been very wealthy, and so David becomes a very wealthy man. You can marry more money in 5 minutes than you can make in a lifetime. David demonstrated that. So this is what brings us to the stage tonight. Is that a good summary? Okay, all right. Great dramatic story. Okay. We are at chapter 28, verse 1. In those days, the Philistines, you remember them, mustered their military forces to fight against Israel. So Achish said to David, Achish, by the way, is one of the 5 kings. I believe he's the king of Gath, which is the same city, Philistine city-state that Goliath was from. So Achish said to David, you realize, of course, that you and your warriors must march out for battle with me. So Achish is putting David to the test. Are you really on my side? Are you really going to attack your fellow countrymen and fight with me? So he wants to put David to the test to see if David would respond. David answered Achish, good, now you shall learn what your servant can do. So he was happy, or he's feigning, as we will see later, that he is happy to go out and fight against his own countrymen. Then Achish said to David, I shall appoint you as my permanent bodyguard, which is, it's like being what was Colin Powell during the first Gulf War? He was the chief of staff of the...
Chief of staff, yeah.
Yeah, that's what you mean by your personal. This is what that would be equivalent to. Now, Samuel was dead. Remember, the prophet Samuel had died. All Israel had mourned for him and buried him in his city, Ramah, which is not too far from Bethlehem. Meanwhile, Saul had driven mediums and diviners out of the land. Now, this is the first time this is ever mentioned. Mediums and diviners are people that consult the spiritual world for your fortune. This has been around for a very long time. However, it is condemned in the Torah, in the book of Leviticus, in the book of Deuteronomy. Divinization and the work of mediums was, the penalty was the death penalty, capital punishment. So if you were going to do any divinization, you have to go to the high priest. So you could see how the religious institution of that day didn't want any competitors, and also in later times it was interpreted that that if you don't go to someone who is a prophet of God or a priest of God, then all of these others are serving the devil. But at this time, there's no concept of the devil. So, mediums and diviners were, Saul had driven them out of the land. Verse 4, the Philistines rallied, and coming to Shunem, they encamped. So they're headed inland, and to a higher altitude, they're ready to invade southern Israel. Saul too, that is King Saul, mustered all Israel. They camped on Gilboa. When Saul saw the Philistine camp, he grew afraid and lost heart completely. So apparently the Philistines had a very impressive military presence. He consulted the Lord, but the Lord gave no answer. Neither in dreams, nor by Urim, remember the Urim and the Thummim, nor through the prophets. Those were the ways you would hear from God. Well, Saul had murdered the high priest's family, so there's no way he was going to get anything from the Urim and Thummim. He received no dreams or visions, and there was no prophets. So it was as if God was not talking to Saul. Then Saul said to his servants, find me a medium through whom I seek counsel. So Saul is desperate to consult with someone who would know the outcome of the battle that is about to happen, so he would know what to do. So he's even contradicting his own decree that drove mediums and witches and fortune tellers out of the land of Israel. Not only that, but he is also breaking the laws of Torah. And then his servants answered him, there is a woman in Endor who is a medium. By the way, Endor, that's a town in Israel. But Endor, wasn't that a
King
planet in Star Wars?
King Lear, wasn't it?
It's, yeah,
King Lear?
that's where the little fuzzy guys.
Yeah. I thought so when they said the planet Endor in the Return of the Jedi, I thought, wow, where'd they get that?
Now you know.
King Lear was king of Endor in the story of King
In one
Lear?
of, I think in one of his plays, he
Well, that's
mentions
interesting.
Endor. Yes.
So, yeah. Well, this is probably where they got the name, Endor. So, what does Saul do? Well, Saul's reducing himself to this kind of duplicity. Look what he does. Here's the king of Israel. This is how far he's sunk. He's really playing the hypocrite because he wants to visit this woman in Endor who's a medium. So he disguised himself and putting on other clothes and set out with 2 companions. So he's going undercover. They came to the woman at night, under the cover of night. And believe me, in the ancient world, when the sun went down, it was dark. There were no street lights. Yeah. So under the shadow of the night, they came to the woman at night, and Saul said to her, divine for me, conjure up the spirit I tell you. And the woman answered him, you know that's what Saul has done. She doesn't know it's Saul. You know what Saul has done. So see the irony here that the writer's creating here? How he expelled the mediums and diviners from the land. Then why are you trying to entrap me and get me killed? But Saul swore to her by the Lord, as the Lord lives, you shall incur no blame for this. Whom do you want me to conjure up? The woman asked him. Conjure up Samuel for me. Remember Samuel, the prophet who died? So Saul is desperate to consult with Samuel, who was really his enemy. But you could tell he never really got over Saul. Verse 12, when the woman saw Samuel, so Samuel does appear. She conjures him up. There's an apparition. She shrieked at the top of her voice and said to Saul, why have you deceived me? You are Saul. But the king said to her, do not be afraid. What do you see? I see a God rising from the earth, she replied. That's referring to Samuel. What does he look like? Asked Saul. An old man is coming up, wrapped in a robe, she replied. Saul knew that it was Samuel, and so he bowed his face to the ground in homage. Samuel then said to Saul, now he's speaking through this woman, why do you disturb me by conjuring me up? Saul replied, I am in great distress, for the Philistines are waging war against me, and God has turned away from me. Since God no longer answers me through prophets or in dreams, I have called upon you to tell me what I should do. So this Samuel said, but why do you ask me, if the Lord has abandoned you for your neighbor? The Lord has done to you what he declared through me. He has torn the kingdom from your hand and has given it over to your neighbor David. Ooh, this is not good. Because you disobeyed the Lord's directive and would not carry out his fierce anger against Amalek. Remember the Amalekites? Saul was to completely liquidate them. It's called genocide today. Saul was too merciful to them. This made Samuel angry. The Lord has done this to you today because you didn't follow what God was telling me to tell you. You almost must get the impression that I kind of have I question Samuel. He's portrayed as somehow being the good guy, but I see Samuel as a questionable figure. But anyway, so the hatred that Samuel had while he was alive for Saul is being expressed to Saul through this medium after Samuel had died. So it hasn't gone away. So, moreover, verse 19, the Lord will deliver Israel, and you as well, into the hands of the Philistines. Oh. By tomorrow, you and your sons will be with me. In other words, you're going to be dead. And the Lord will have delivered the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines. It will be a great defeat. Immediately Saul fell full length on the ground in great fear because of Samuel's message. He had no strength left, since he had eaten nothing all that day and night. Then the woman came to Saul, and seeing that he was quite terror-stricken, said to him, "Remember, your maidservant obeyed you. I took my life in my hands and carried out the request you made of me. Now you, in turn, please listen to your maidservant. Let me set out a bit of food for you to eat, so that you are strong enough to go on your way." But he refused. "I will not eat." However, when his servants joined the woman in urging him, he listened to their entreaties, got up from the ground, and sat on a couch. The woman had a stall-fed calf in the house, which he now quickly slaughtered. What's a stall-fed calf? It would be veal,
Oh, yeah.
which is a delicacy. So this witch of Endor was wealthy. She made money at her trade. And she was probably an independent woman. What I mean by independent, she was probably an economically independent woman, which she didn't have to be married. She sustained herself economically. They were few and far between, but they did exist. We think that Mary Magdala was also an independent woman, that she was not living in her father's house, nor was she dependent upon a husband. You see this again and again on occasion. I think of Lydia, who St. Paul went to in Philippi. She was the head of her own household. So there were women who had means, and they were independent women. In other words, they weren't dependent on men for their existence. They were often ridiculed, though. And usually they became independent through either they somehow inherited a business, or they were successful prostitutes. They ran a brothel, or they did what the woman of Endor did, and that is she was a medium. So then they quickly slaughtered the stall-fed calf, then taking flour, she kneaded it, and baked unleavened bread, that is, bread without yeast. She set the meal before Saul and his servants, and they ate. Then they got up and left the same night. So this will be Saul's last supper. Okay. Any thoughts or insights? Anything strike you about what we just looked at?
Well, I, for one, have trouble with all of the murder and slaughter of people. Apparently, there's no respect for life. And it's not considered evil or wrong to kill your neighbor. It's just a concept I can't get my head around. Anyway, I like to forget the part when he had to annihilate the whole group.
Yeah.
This is the old.
Yeah.
I know, but I still struggle.
I think that most people don't read the Bible, and when they sit down and get around to reading the Bible, because a lot of people think, I gotta, it's got to be on my bucket list to read the Bible before, and then when they start reading straight through and they come to a lot of these narratives in what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, they're shocked and stunned that stuff's in the Bible. And the Bible is, in a sense, and I don't like to refer to the Bible because that diminishes the fact these are individual writers and different kinds of documents. But in the collection, even though the writers have their own particular agenda and bias, the idea of objective history did not exist. They always wrote with a purpose in mind. But the Bible's just recording the way it was. And in tribal society, in ancient society, it was a very violent world. You were more than likely to be killed by another human being than by a wild animal. This is true all the way up through the medieval period. The story of human violence is just, it's a universal phenomenon. There are ethnic groups that have been completely wiped out and no longer exist, language groups that no longer exist with us, genetic groups are no longer with us. And this is why a lot of anthropologists believe that it was probably Homo sapien that destroyed and drove our closest relative, a different human species called Neanderthal. The
You know,
belief
it's
is
not
that because we are extremely violent creatures to each other.
Violence is one thing, and I can accept that, but to
Wholesale
claim that you're
slaughters.
righteous and a God-fearing person
Yeah.
and in touch with God and communicate with God and through prophets and even in some cases a priest, and at the same time you're annihilating people, I guess that's the part I have trouble with, you know, the fact that it's almost hypocritical. You know,
Yeah.
maybe, didn't Moses have his tablets by this time that gave some sort of behavioral laws?
Yeah, but you don't find Moses ever proscribing, that is, forbidding war. So the reason why you're so appalled by this is because you're looking through a lens
Yeah,
into the
probably.
past, and the lens you're looking through is the lens of the teaching of Jesus.
Yeah, yeah.
Jesus was such a departure from all of this way of thinking,
Yeah.
that God, if you win a war or a battle, then somehow God blessed you and enabled you to do that. Yeah, God is portrayed as being just as violent as human beings in the Hebrew Scriptures.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
And I think there's another presupposition underlying all of this, and that is, we assume that the other is like us. But in these stories, whereas the assumption is the other is not like us, the other may not even be really fully human. And therefore the other can be slaughtered because they're in our way and we're the ones who are in the right, and they obviously aren't. But if you're not perceiving the other as fully human or fully like yourself, then that opens the door to all of this without any sense of guilt, really.
Yeah.
Because I don't read guilt, you know,
There
we're
isn't.
gonna slaughter all these people, men, women, children,
Yeah.
and then the story moves on.
David's behavior towards that Achish and all his people, I mean, he was a total fraud. He misrepresented himself. He acted like he was loyal. He lied to him, said, I'm going out and raiding your enemies, and he was actually doing the opposite. You know, and I hate to say it, but some of these things, you know, they haven't really ended. The enmity between those groups are still deep in our society, and it really
Well,
bothers me that the house of David, that you know, is where the Messiah came from. It has this totally unethical from our
Well, and that, I
modern
think that's
thing.
one of the reasons why the Jewish concept of Messiah is really so different from what we have in Jesus as the Messiah. I mean, and I am very fond now of going to the first century of the Common Era and looking at what the Jewish idea of the Messiah was versus what Jesus is saying the Messiah is, and that he is the Messiah. But look at what's going on here. We got night and day practically in terms of what the Messiah is supposed to be like. But in reference to your concerns, we see it right now in the Middle East. Ethnic groups are being slaughtered by ISIS, men, women, and children.
In the name of their God.
In the name of their God. Women
Yeah.
raped multiple times.
Yeah, that
You
is
know,
true.
It's terrible.
In a current framework, the departure of remorse,
The
is
dep-
in current times, that departure of remorse or guilt, or even that filter, is just a psychopath behavior.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
By definition, and
Yeah.
it's interesting that it was culturally, I was part of what happened, you know, more frequently there. But in today's society, you look at a serial killer, you look at somebody that has that ability to depart from that emotionally, as defined now, several, you know, a couple thousand years later, as a psychopath.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a crazy thing.
Yeah, and people, and this is a time which tribalism was extremely strong, and It was a world in which you either kill or be killed. You know, it, you couldn't survive if you were going to be a pacifist at this time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the world has changed quite a bit, but the coming of Jesus is a big part of what's changed the world and our ethical and moral thinking, the way we look at these things. And so really, if you're looking at this and being appalled, you can thank Jesus for that.
I do.
Yeah, you know, because that propensity to reduce the other as something less than me, as being not fully human, we still do that today.
Yeah.
In fact, that in warfare, our soldiers are taught to kill and not to take into consideration the ethical implications of what they're doing. And then when you're in a battle zone, it's either kill or be killed. Now, I've never been in the military, but Bob, were you in the military? What in your training? It was about get the enemy. It was like,
Oh, yeah, they taught us to, how to use guns and the whole 9 yards. I mean, the purpose of the military is defend the country, and sometimes that means go on the offense. So,
Yeah.
I mean.
Deadly
that's all.
force.
Yeah, deadly force, yeah.
yeah. So interesting, huh? Any other thoughts or questions about the material we're reading? It's going to get even more interesting. Was that chapter 28?
I found
it interesting that it was the role of the dice. You know,
Gambling.
you really had, in those terms, it was, you would go to another man, and they simply, ask a question, and it was simply a roll of dice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was incredible.
Well,
Peter.
and that kind of goes hand in hand. Yes,
And John had a.
John.
I was thinking about this medium and her accuracy, and we think that these people today are charlatans and such, but she seemed to be spot on.
Yeah,
Or
sure.
was she that familiar with the history of the day?
That's a good question. I don't know. That's worth speculating on. You have a thought, Polly?
Yeah, I think she might have been a plot device as well. Whoever was writing this wanted her to come up with this, so
That's a good point.
Yeah.
it ain't necessarily so.
Could have been fictional.
She could have been a plot device because whoever's writing this wanted her to be right and put the fear of God into Saul. So I agree with what you're saying. If she was true, it would be a remarkable thing. But maybe not. Maybe she was just brought into it to reinforce what they were saying.
Well, as Peter's been saying all along, these authors have an agenda.
Exactly, exactly.
The authors have an agenda.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mixed
Remember,
bag of fiction.
this book is a compilation of writings and compilations that were edited together, and it was edited later in history under the monarchy, which was the Davidic dynasty. So these writings, in a way, had a political objective, and that is to legitimize David and his family as the rightful royal family of Israel. So you have to always take those kinds of things when you're looking at this. These are comes from the National Archives of a city-state. Now, there's something else that would be worth noting here, and that is how many were at Sunday adult ed? Did you go to the adult ed on Sunday? And Tony is in. I recommend it. It's 2 more Sundays after. There's Tony Battaglia, who is a retired professor of religious studies, is doing a study on the Axial Age, which takes place about 500 years after this time. Before the Axial Age, people pretty much worshiped tribal gods, and your tribal gods were really on your side. And if you defeated another tribe, it meant your god defeated their god. You see, it was your religion was was there to ensure the cohesion of your own particular social group. and you worship your particular tribal deity in the hopes that he will be able to deliver you from your enemies. That's a very primitive thing, notion in religion. And remember, this is pre-axial age. When the axial age comes along, which is a 200-year period, I understand, this is when you have the Buddha, Confucius, Zoroaster, and the Greek philosophers, the pre-Socratics and stuff. So all of a sudden there seems to be a shift that seems to be universal across cultures in Eurasia among human beings, where now religion is starting to achieve a higher ideal or ideals, in which God is seen as more universal and that God is more interested in the virtues. So religion changes, but at this time, religion was a very brutal and self-serving affair. Yeah.
There's something else that has always puzzled me in this story about bringing Samuel up, conjuring him up, and that is that we are taught that basically the Israelites thought of death sort of like Hades, that Sheol was the place of departed spirits, but the departed spirits were sort of like shadows of their former self. It's like you're a real self and your shadow is clearly not the same as you. And when you die, you're pretty much like a shadow. So you're pretty much like a shadow. If you think of your life now as your real life, and then when you die, and we walk around with a shadow, but when you die, then what's left of you is sort of like a shadow, not like your whole real self, which was what was real when you were alive. So all of a sudden we've got Samuel coming up, being conjured up, and in this story I more or less read him as like a real person, not like some sort of a shadow of what was the real Samuel. And that's always sort of bugged me, I'll just put it that way, because it doesn't really make sense with the general idea of what happens after you die, but does give more credibility to the idea that eventually everybody's going to figure out that God is the God of the living and not of the dead.
Yeah.
But anyway, I just thought I'd raise that because I find it a very little interesting
I think it
idea here.
almost gives more credibility to what Polly was saying earlier. This guy is too spot on. It fits too well. It's probably a plot device.
Great discussion. We'll move on to chapter 29. This is going to probably stir some more conversation here. Okay, are you there? Chapter 29. Now the Philistines, we're at verse 1, had mustered all their forces in Ephek. And the Israelites were encamped at the spring in Jezreel. Jezreel was a large open plain, the kind of place that armies would be able to maneuver and battle. As the Philistine lords were marching, their units of 100 and 1,000, David and his warriors were marching in the rear guard with Achish, the king of the Philistines. The Philistine commanders asked, "What are those Hebrews doing here?" It's a different ethnic group. The Philistines are very different than these Hebrews. We don't hear that phrase Hebrews very often, but it shows up here. But he's referring to the Israelites. And the language they spoke was Hebrew, so they're referring to what their dialect or language they're speaking. Achish answered them, "Why, that is, David, the officer of Saul, king of Israel. He has been with me for a year or two, and from the day he came over to me until now, I have never found fault in him." But the Philistine commanders were angered at this and said to him, "Send that man back. Let him return to the place you picked out for him. He must not go down into battle with us. During the battle, he might become our enemy. For how else can he win back his master's favor?" Referring to Saul. "If not at the expense of our soldiers. Is this not the David for whom they sing during their dances? Saul has slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands. Notice that his officer corps are very suspicious about David. But Achish seems to be taken in by David. But read on. So Achish summoned David and said to him, "As the Lord lives, you are honest, and I would want you with me in all my battles. To this day I found nothing wrong with you since you came to me. But in the view of the chiefs, you are not welcome. Leave peacefully now, and do nothing that might displease the Philistine chiefs." But David said to Achish, "What have I done? What fault have you found in your servant from the day I entered your service until today, that I cannot go to fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" "I recognize," Achish answered David, "that you are trustworthy like an angel of God. But the Philistine commanders are saying he must not go with us into battle. So the first thing tomorrow, you and your Lord's servants who came with you, go to the place I picked out for you. Do not take to heart their worthless remarks, for you have been valuable in my service. But make an early morning start as soon as it grows light, and be on your way." So David and his warriors left early in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines, to go back. And the Philistines went up to Jezreel, that is, to meet the armies of Saul. So David is still, as you said, Ned, he's still keeping up the, he's still defrauding Achish. He's playing the game.
But also look at the language of Achish. He speaks about the Lord says. You know, I've got the Jerusalem Bible says, Achish says, "As Yahweh lives, you are loyal." And then later on he says something like, Achish answered, "You know that in my sight you are as blameless as an angel of God." So Achish, the Philistine, is recognizes Yahweh and the Lord.
Yeah.
What is this? Where is this from? I thought they were, had their own God.
Yeah, they did. Remember, Dagon was the
Yeah.
Philistine god.
But he likes Yahweh too.
Yeah, which is very, by the way, which is very common in the ancient world. They would accept each other's gods and goddesses quite
So when he's
often.
speaking to David, out of respect to David, he speaks of Yahweh as being my God, just like your. So he's-
Well, and also he probably worshipped Yahweh along with Dagon. You know, I mean,
Right, sure.
it was that polytheists would do that. You know, whichever God answered your prayers, you're going to pray to, even if it's someone else's God. Yeah. But yeah, that is interesting because it shows you that he was very familiar with the God Yahweh and considered Yahweh. He didn't question the fact that Yahweh was a God. Yeah.
And it wasn't our God fighting your God, or our gods fighting your
Yeah.
God.
That's interesting too. That's a departure.
Mine has a footnote that says Achish shows his respect for David by swearing by David's God. So I think that's kind of also an
Yeah.
interesting dynamic there too, is he's showing, hey, by your God, you've been honest and I respect you. So.
Yeah, it sounds like Achish is really acting in good faith towards David and has really taken David in and is trying his best to accommodate David.
And David's taken him in too.
But David's doing it in a different sense of that. Did you hear that? Paulie said,
Yeah.
I said that Achish is really taking David in. I was using it in the positive sense. And Paulie says, yeah, and David's really taking Achish in in the negative sense.
Well, this one, there's a comment here, it says, David tactics described in a previous reference were highly successful. Tactics, it sounds like it's exactly. David's tactics, he's referring to his relationship with Achish. I found no fault in it. David's tactics described in 27:10 through 12 were highly successful. So he's taken in, I think they're referring to the fact that he's taken in Achish.
Now we move on to, if there's any more discussion on chapter 29? Okay. We're going to move on with our reading to chapter 30. I hope that for those of you here for the first time, I know that you're coming at the very end of this study, but I hope you're getting something from it and enjoying it. It's interesting. And so we begin at first verse of chapter 30. Before David and his men reached Ziklag, remember Ziklag was the city where David and his men kept their families. On the third day, the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. That Ziklag and the Negev is at the southernmost part of Israel, and the Amalekites were nomadic peoples and warriors that lived as raiders, and they lived further south in the Sinai Desert. So the Amalekites now raid the city of that was where David's headquarters was, Ziklag. They stormed Ziklag and they set it on fire. They took captive the women and all who were in the city, young and old, killing no one, and they herded them off when they left. So these are the families, the wives and the children of David and his men. David and his men arrived at the city to find it burned to the ground and their wives, sons, and daughters taken captive. Then David and those who were with him wept aloud until they could weep no more. David's two wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal from Carmel, had also been carried off. Now, that's David's two wives. Now, David found himself in great danger, for the soldiers spoke of stoning him, so bitter were they over the fate of their sons and daughters. David took courage in the Lord his God, and said to Abiathar, that's the high priest, the son of Ahimelech, bring me the ephod. What's the ephod? That breast clothing, they had the pockets with the Urim and Thummim. When Abiathar brought him the ephod, David inquired of the Lord. Here's the question: shall I pursue these raiders? Can I overtake them? And so Abiathar throws the dice, and the Lord answered him, go in pursuit, for you will certainly overtake them and bring about a rescue. Verse 9, so David went off with his 600. He has 600 warriors with him. This is definitely a warrior culture. As far as the Wadi Besor, where those who were to remain behind halted. David continued the pursuit with 400, but 200 were too exhausted to cross the wadi. You know, wadi is a dried out riverbed, which is common in that part of the world, as it's common here in Southern California. And remained behind. An Egyptian was found in the open country and brought to David. So there's a wandering Egyptian there in the wilderness. They gave him food to eat and water to drink. They also offered a cake of pressed figs and 2 cakes of pressed raisins. When he had eaten, he revived, for he had not taken food nor drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. Then David asked him, to whom do you belong? Where do you come from? I am an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite. Because the Amalekites were equal opportunity raiders. They would often raid the border country of Egypt as much as they would Israel or the Philistines. They were all around. They were like pirates. You know, they're just kind of wild and crazy, like Bedouins almost. So this Egyptian was a slave of an Amalekite. My master abandoned me 3 days ago because I fell sick. We raided the Negev of the Cherethites, the territory of Judah, and the Negev of Caleb, which is a clan of Judah. And we set Ziklag on fire. So now David knows he's on the right trail. He's found someone who can inform him. The Amalekites made a tactical error. Don't you see that? Leaving this guy behind. David then asked him, will you lead me down to these raiders? He answered, swear to me by God that you will not kill me or hand me over to my master, and I will lead you down to the raiders. Yeah, he's ready to sing. Yeah. So he led them down, and there were the Amalekites lounging all over the ground, eating, drinking, and celebrating. because of all the rich plunder they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. So they were having a big party. From dawn to sundown the next day, David attacked them, allowing no one to escape except 400 young men who mounted their camels and fled. David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken, and he rescued his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, small or great, plunder or sons or daughters, of all that the Amalekites had taken. David brought back everything. Moreover, David took all the sheep and oxen, and as they drove these before him, they shouted, "This is David's plunder." So they come back even richer because now they have all the Amalekites' plunder. Now, I have to say here, what's this going to do with in terms of David's relationship with his men?
Starting to
A
talk.
lot of loyalty there.
Yeah, he's going to need it. He's going to need it because there will be a war of succession. But his men are his merry men, which have been with him now for a period of time on the run. They really bond with David, and this is really going to do it because David is the hero here. He rescues all of them. Of what they lost. They defeated the Amalekites in warfare, and not only that, but they're even enriched. So their loyalty to David will become very solid now. Verse 21, when David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow him, whom he had left behind at the Wadi of Besor, they came out to meet David and the men with him. As David approached, he greeted them, but all the greedy and worthless among those who had accompanied David said, "Since they did not accompany us, we will not give them anything from the plunder except for each man's wife and children."
Well, thanks for at
Those
least
are the
giving
rules
that.
of war. You know, the ones who won the battle get the spoils. But David said, "You must not do this, my brothers. After what the Lord has given us, the Lord has protected us and delivered us into our hands, the raiders that came against us. Who could agree with this proposal of yours?" In other words, David's showing his faith here. We didn't win this battle because of our own skill. It's because the Lord enabled us to win. "Rather, the share of the one who goes down to battle shall be the same as that of the one who remains with the baggage. They share alike." Wow. David is really a different kind of leader, isn't he? What's this going to do with his relationship? Yeah, Bob?
Raise it,
Yeah.
raise it up.
He's a very wise leader. He is one of those natural leaders of men.
Knows motivation.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think
strategy.
maybe what they don't say here is 200 men are not going to just be too tired to cross the river.
Yeah.
They've been in battles earlier, and I think they're wounded or such, and
Yeah.
probably can't travel. So they've already put forth
And that's
their service.
Right. And I think David didn't forget that. You can see how magnanimous David is. A good leader is magnanimous.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because he could have sided with those who wanted to hold on to this stuff, and there would be nothing no one could do. But now he's endearing himself all the more to those who are with him. Even the ones who were the greedy ones probably feel a little embarrassed and ashamed and really see and really probably admire, even though David overruled them, they probably admired him for this. They learned something about what greatness really is, what makes a good leader.
Doesn't this story remind you a little bit about the workers going to the vineyard? Some started
Yes.
at some at noon. I
Yes.
said, doesn't this story remind you a little bit about the workers that go into the vineyard? Some start at 8 in the morning, and some start at noon, and some start at 4, and they all get paid the same.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a tremendous amount of loyalty between a leader and his men.
Is there?
John Bassalom was like that in World War II when Iwo Jima and he got killed there, but his men would go wherever he did. There's a tremendous amount of loyalty between a leader and the men that follow him. You really bond.
For the good leaders.
Yes.
In battle,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
really comes out. So I do think you bring up something very interesting. that Jesus tells this parable about the workers in the vineyard all getting paid the same, even though some would say, I worked longer, how'd you get more? Yeah, in fact, in verse 25, David said about sharing, they share alike, and from that day forward, he made this a law and a custom in Israel, as it still is to this day. So whenever this was being written, which was a long time ago. But,
I think what that does is it elevates everyone.
yes,
Because you get in a situation where it's human nature to feel guilty if you don't contribute, right?
yeah.
So that move right there wasn't divisive, but it elevated everybody. So in that moment,
Wow.
it sort of shifted everybody into a little bit more thinking.
So it's kind of it's a win-win for everybody.
You know, we have just abandoned all that strategy that David was going through with the Philistines. How did he profit by that? I mean, he did this fraudulent ruse for such a long time.
Well,
And then, boom, it's over. I mean, what did he gain?
Not with them anymore.
well, you're going to see that in a moment. But,
Oh, we
yeah.
are. Oh, good, good, good. Closure.
Yeah, yeah,
Wraps it all up.
yeah, it's kind of a loose thread, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Okay. When David came to Ziklag, he sent part of the plunder to his friends, the elders of Judah, saying, "This is a gift to you from the plunder of the enemies of the Lord, namely to those in Bethel, Ramoth Negev, Jatir, Aroer, Sifmoth, Eshtimoah, Rakal, Jerah, Melite, cities and Canaanite cities," that's a clan, Canaanites, Hormah, Borhashan, Aphach, Hebron, and to all the places that David and his men had frequented. So what is David doing?
Reason fine.
He's making friends. He's a shrewd politician
Yeah.
as well as a military leader. Because people are going to say, oh, we came to all this. Who gave it to us? David. Did he have to? No. But when you accept gifts from someone, you are now put into their debt.
Yeah, obligatory.
Yeah, so David is very good. He's consolidating power of the people of Judah, which is the largest of the 12 tribes. Judah will become his power base, politically.
Yeah, I like, mine has a comment that I like the way they put it. All these places, including Bethel, were in Judah. It is little wonder that David would soon be made king of Judah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's well said. Yeah, what happens is that before David becomes king of all Israel, the people of Judah make him the king of their tribe. And that will happen on his way. So he's quite brilliant as a leader. And now we come to the last chapter, 31. I have it. Do you all have 31?
Yes.
You know we're actually going to finish this tonight? Can you believe it?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. The death of Saul and his sons. Now the Philistines went to war against Israel, and the Israelites fled before them and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines pressed hard after Saul and his sons. When the Philistines had struck down Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, sons of Saul, the fury of the battle converged on Saul. So now Saul and his family are engaged in this battle, and it's not going well. Then the archers hit him, and he was severely wounded. Saul said to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through. Otherwise these uncircumcised will come and abuse me." But the armor bearer, badly frightened, refused. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. Wow. So here is the demise of the first king of Israel. His behavior was self-destructive for a long time. And so here, he's truly a picture of a tragic person, a tragic character, because he is his own undoing, and even at the end, he commits suicide. When the armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell upon his sword and died with him. Thus Saul, his 3 sons, and his armor bearer died together that same day. When the Israelites on the slope of the valley and those along the Jordan saw that the men of Israel had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their cities and fled. Then the Philistines came and lived in those cities. On the following day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. They cut off Saul's head and stripped him of his armor. These they sent throughout the land of the Philistines to bring the good news to the temple of their idols and to the people. They put his armor in the temple of Astarte. She's a goddess, an earth goddess. Astarte would be similar to other goddesses in the ancient Middle East and the Mediterranean world. They put his armor in the temple of Astarte, but impaled his body, which is now headless, on the wall of Beth-shan. When the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their warriors set out and traveled through the night. They removed the bodies of Saul and his sons from the wall of Beth-shan, and returning to Jabesh, burned them. They cremated them, which their practice was to bury the dead. So the Philistines had done such damage and degraded the corpses so much that it is believed that that's why they cremated the bodies. Then they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree in Jabesh and fasted for 7 days. That's the traditional mourning period. And so ends the first book of Samuel. Any thoughts on this last passage? Tragic, isn't it, for Samuel?
Yeah.
Now, when we start next week with 2 Samuel, we're going to get into that. It's going to tie up a few loose ends, like what about the
David,
Philistines?
yeah,
And we'll see how David deals with the Philistines. And also, we will see that it's not like David all of a sudden becomes king. There's political realities. There's still people who are a part of the family of Saul who have claim to the throne. So there will be civil war happening before David finally becomes king of all Israel and consolidates his power. And he becomes the greatest king of all Israel.
Do we know how long Saul was king for?
We really don't, because this is what we're told by the biblical narrative. Did you hear that? Do we know how long that Saul reigned? According to the writers of Samuel and of the book of Kings, Saul reigned for 40 years. David reigns for 40 years, and Solomon reigns for 40 years. Now, 40 years can't be taken literally. It just means they reigned a long time, and the time was the perfect time. You know, these numbers, we look for mathematical exact precision. That's not the Hebrew mindset. So they'll use numbers like 7 or 3 or you always see, notice how there was something mentioned about 3 days?
Yeah.
Here, you see that a lot throughout the biblical record. And even Jesus is said to have been dead 3 days before he was raised. The 40 days, they spent 40 years in the wilderness. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights. Jesus went out for 40 days in the wilderness. These are not numbers that we can take at face value literally, because the Hebrews used numbers in a very different way. It was symbolic. So all we can say, God knows how long they reigned, but it was a long time. And if you were living in Israel at the time, it did seem like he was king for too long.
I have a question way off topic, but where did the 12 tribes come from?
Jacob, who
Oh, Jacob and his sons.
he has 12 sons.
Right.
and the 12 sons become the patriarchs of 12 tribes. Now, Jacob's name is changed from Jacob to Israel.
Right.
So it becomes the 12 tribes of Israel. Israel is Jacob's name. Sometimes Israel is used to refer, that's the common word to refer to the nation of the 12 tribes as Israel, but sometimes in the prophetic writings, Israel is referred to as Jacob. They're used interchangeably because everyone is descendants of Israel. Yes.
One last little footnote. Remember back in chapter 11,
Yeah?
when there was a community that was going to be attacked by the Ammonites. And the Ammonites said, we're going to be nice to you, we'll make a treaty from you, but we're going to put out the right eye of all of you. And then that group said, well, give us a little time to think about it. In the meantime, they went to Saul, and Saul said, I'm going to come and help you. And then they said to the Ammonites something like, well, we're going to come over tomorrow. And then Saul came and rescued you. Well, that community was Jabesh Gilead, which explains in that last paragraph why the inhabitants sent their warriors out to take his body down, which probably was a pretty dangerous
Yes.
feat to do, to go to Philistine territory and have a battlefield.
Wow.
So basically, that was their paying back Saul and his lineage for that, for saving them. I thought that was kind of.
Oh, that is. There's a little bit of humanity there. They didn't forget what Saul did for them.
They didn't forget.
So they were the ones that retrieved his
Yeah,
body.
yeah.
Wow.
So back to chapter.
Somebody figured that out.
Wow.
Well, it's in a footnote. Yeah.
I had an observation real quick.
Yeah.
In times where there's battles and killing and death and dead bodies everywhere, today we're very prudent about burying the dead, collecting the dead, putting the dead, not just laying out in the open because of the dangers of disease and other things. Apparently, when there were so many people killed and their bodies retrieved and impaled and nailed to the cross and everything, and bodies apparently were just laying around for days. So I speculate that perhaps because of this custom, that perhaps there was a lot of disease caused by these dead bodies, and it sort of correlates with the man at the end of the table. I'm sorry, I don't know what your name was. Steve, okay, it's similar to what he said earlier today about the psychopaths, because lack of nutrition, various diseases, inbreeding, all of these kinds of things can cause mental illness. And I'm wondering if perhaps those customs with dealing with the dead kind of contributed toward the psychopathic behavior or development of psychopathic type mental illnesses.
I think that's a really interesting speculation or consideration.
Well, it is a speculation.
Life was much more
right.
brutal in the past, and they didn't
Yeah.
understand how disease worked.
Right, yeah.
And so they didn't realize that. But what was really interesting is that the priests of Israel, were forbidden to ever touch a dead body.
Yeah,
That's interesting.
yeah, it is.
So,
But several weeks ago, wasn't someone in this group talking about how most probably more people were killed because of disease on the battlefield than
Oh, yeah, that's all, that was true up through the Civil War.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
life was
It just
brutal
don't-
then. It's brutal now, but really, to live in the ancient world.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think this was a great study. Thank you, everybody, for being a part of this. And I want to thank Liz and Steve and Kristen for joining us tonight. And I hope you'll show up next week as we begin 2 Samuel. Let's,
Yeah. Oh, yeah, you can be late. That's really okay.
Peter, we'd like to thank you for taking the time to share your knowledge with us.
Oh.
Yes, thank you.
It's a pleasure. I love this stuff, so thank you very much. I'm glad that I'm able to excite your interest and so,
It does make a difference.
well,
Your
thank you.
enthusiasm.
Thank you. Anybody have any intentions that you would like to offer as we pray together?
For those people that were killed today by the,
Oh,
there was another terrorist attack in Iran, was it?
Pakistan.
Pakistan, that's right, it was Pakistan.
Well, it's
20
ours.
people were murdered.
it's a small end. Wow. Let us pray for all those who have been victims of violence, those who have lost loved ones through acts of human violence. Let us pray that the human race someday will be delivered from this propensity of violent behavior, that we will truly live in peace with one another. This is our prayer, O God, as we offer this up, as we pray in the words Jesus taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. We belong to you, O Lord of our longing. We belong to you in our daily living, dying and rising. We belong to you. We belong to you, O Lord of our longing. We belong to you in our daily living, dying and rising. We